Welcome, everyone, to today's Alaska Collaborative on Health and the Environment webinar, entitled From Exploration to Closure of a Large-Scale Mine, Environmental and Health Impacts of the Proposed Donlin Gold Mine on the Watershed, Communities, and People of the Yukon-Kuskokwim Region here in Alaska. I'm Nick Reardon, your host for today's Alaska webinar on behalf of Alaska Community Action on Toxics. It's another beautiful snowy day here in Anchorage, Alaska. And yeah, I'd like to note that my home and office here on the traditional and unceded lands of the Dena'ina people. And me and my coworkers at Alaska Community Action on Toxics want to express our appreciation for past and present stewards of this incredible place. And I invite you all to thank the stewards of your respective homes as well. As a little background, Alaska is a regional partner of a national collaborative on health and the environment. That's hence the abbreviation CHE for CHE, that includes over 5,000 individuals and organizations in 87 countries, including all 50 states. So together, CHE and Alaska and these other partners work to advance knowledge and action related to links between human health and environmental factors. So you can check out our websites to learn more, akaction.org and healthandtheenvironment.org. Our session today will last 1 hour and include presentations from Dr. Dave Chambers, the founder and president of the Center for Science and Public Participation, as well as Mary Herrera-Matthias, the environmental program director for ONC in Bethel, Alaska. They'll be walking us through the process and associated environmental and health risks associated with establishing, running, and closing a large-scale metal mine like the proposed Donlin Gold project in Southwest Alaska, with insight and examples specific to the Yukon-Kuskokwim region, the ecosystem, and the people and communities who live there. So, as always, feel free to ask questions throughout the webinar. You can use Zoom's Q&A feature, which I think there should be a button there at the bottom of your screen, or you can type them into the chat box at any time. It's not distracting to us. And we're thinking we'll take some questions after Dave's presentation and then again after Mary's. And we've allocated about 20 minutes for that. So please, yeah, join us for questions and discussion. So welcome again, Mary and Dave. Dave, go ahead and share your screen and begin when ready.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to throw a few slides up here for you. So what I'd like to do this afternoon is talk about potential environmental impacts from the Donlin mine. That is, we certainly can't say they're going to happen, but it's the sort of thing I look for when I start reviewing a mine for unplanned effects. That is, no mine is ever issued a permit with the certainty that these impacts are going to occur, but nonetheless, they sometimes do, and we need to know what they are, what the consequences are, and what to look for. So today I'm going to throw these into three categories. First, I'm going to call stream disruption, and that's directly related to fish habitat loss. I am certainly not a fish biologist. We'd need to consult them, but it's pretty clear what the physical impacts of laying a gas pipeline and developing a mine site will be. And so I'll touch on those briefly. Then I'll want to move to water. So water and air are two vectors, as it were, to move contamination off of a mine site and into the surrounding land. And from a water perspective, we have basically three sources: the mine tailings, the waste rock, and then the abandoned mine facilities, the pits themselves. And then finally, a few words on air. And with a mine like Donlin, and any mine, there's always dust associated with this industrial development. That can be a vector to take metals and other contaminants off the site. But in addition, the Donlin mine is going to use a somewhat less common processing method called an autoclave to process the ore, and that does pose some additional risks, and I just want to walk through those. So let's start with potential aquatic effects and look at the pipeline. So that pipeline is going to run approximately 300 miles from Cook Inlet all the way out to the Donlin mine site. And what this map shows, and this map comes from the EIS, it just shows the types of terrain that the pipeline will cross. The pipeline itself is so long that you can't really see the streams themselves, but there will be stream crossings, and the pipeline also goes through tundra and wetlands, which are sensitive to disturbance. So again, I can't quantify any potential for fisheries impacts, but roads and fish have never gotten along very well. So it's just a matter of how much impact there will be, as opposed to whether there will be or won't be impact. And then on the mine site itself, and we see a plan view of the mine, approximately how it will look at closure here. There's the open pits, which are going to become a pit lake, the waste rock pile, which is uphill, up gradient from the open pit, and the tailings facility. And as you can see, these disturb existing streams. The tailings facility is built in the upper half to 2/3 of Anaconda Creek. And the mine pit and the waste rock facility are in the American Creek drainage, with a little bit of impact on what's called Lewis Gulch, which is this stream here. This is Crooked Creek, heading towards the river in this to the north. So these facilities will result in the direct loss of some fish habitat, and that will have some impact on fisheries spawning and reproduction areas. What are we worried about in terms of water and contamination at Donlin? Basically two sources here, metals and non-metals. On the metals side, mercury is the primary contaminant of concern. This particular deposit has a lot of mercury in it, and mercury is certainly not uncommon to this area, and it's not unusual to find gold and mercury together. So the mercury is not something that has economic value associated with it. So it has to be collected and removed from the processing. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Turns out there's also quite a bit of arsenic in this particular ore. So arsenic is a consideration. And then in addition to mercury and arsenic, we have antimony, manganese, molybdenum, and selenium in this deposit. And I put an asterisk on arsenic, antimony, and selenium because they're something that are typically termed metalloids instead of metals. That is, they don't behave chemically exactly like metals do. One nice thing about metals is they're typically easier to remove from a dissolved state and precipitated out of a solution. And one of the characteristics of these metalloids is that once they're freed up chemically from their original sulfide matrix, they tend to remain in solution. It's much more difficult to get them out. And that's one of the reasons why around the state of Alaska, for instance, you'll see arsenic as a drinking water problem in a lot of city water sources, because once that arsenic is freed up, it just likes to stay dissolved. So anytime you have arsenic, antimony, and selenium, you want to watch them very closely because they're not easily removed once they're put into solution. And then on the non-metal side, we have sulfate and ammonia. The sulfate is a byproduct of the breakdown of a sulfide mineral. So for instance, with an iron sulfide, if it breaks down, you get an iron molecule, and then that sulfur combines with oxygen and becomes sulfate. Sulfate is not a particularly nasty contaminant, but at very high concentrations, it can cause issues with drinking water, for instance, and it also tends to help mercury complex, something I'll explain a little more in a second. So it is of concern. And then ammonia is something else that's predicted to be in excess of water quality standards in the tailings. That ammonia is generally a result of the degradation of the cyanide that's used in the gold process. So the bad news about ammonia is it is toxic to fish. The good news is it's not a very stable contaminant and tends to break down pretty easily in sunlight in particular. So how about mercury? Elemental mercury is not much of a problem, but when it methylates, that is when it combines with hydrogen and carbon, it becomes biologically available, and methyl mercury is very toxic. So that is a concern. Mercury poses the most risk if you find it in wetlands or slow moving water with high dissolved carbon. That's because in those sorts of environments, it does tend to methylate. So typically it falls out of the air, hits a wetland, and then is converted from the elemental form into the methyl form. And that's what fish and other organisms can take up. Mercury is less risky if you have a clear, fast, oxygenated stream, for instance. That is not a lot of biologic activity going on. And if you just have bare ground and rocks, the elemental mercury doesn't pose much problem at all. So it's mercury and biologic organisms. That's the combination we worry about. So how is mine water going to be controlled at this site? We have water associated with the tailings and the tailings pond, and this is a picture of what the facilities are projected to look like at closure. So we have a reclaimed tailings facility, and with that reclaimed tailings facility, we have a small closure pond here. They plan to take water that accumulates in the closure pond, run it through a pipe, and put it down in the pit lake that will form in the old pits. They plan to take water that seeps from the tailings underneath the dam, similarly pump that into the pit, and then the waste rock storage facility will drain into the pit itself, essentially. Now the pit is going to accumulate water. That is, there'll be more water coming in than evaporates. So they will have to have a water treatment plant post-closure, and they plan to maintain the water at a level in the pit where it doesn't spill out and go over and enter the stream. And right now, the projection is that that water treatment plant is going to have to operate in perpetuity. You never really know you can't predict with a lot of accuracy what's going to go on with the chemistry, with water that infiltrates the waste rock, with water that comes out of the tailings, and the pit lake water itself is also an issue, not only because it receives water from these other two facilities, but because water washes off the exposed pit walls, and that can be contaminated too. This picture on the left comes from the Donlin EIS, and you can see why a mine pit could pose a source, because there's a lot of exposed area here. And when precipitation hits that, it's going to flush anything that's available off of it. These pits can be quite large. The one on the right is from the Gold Strike mine in Nevada, which is a very large mine. And my guess is the Donlin pit complex, there'll be 2 pits there, is probably going to end up somewhere between these 2 sides. I think this is too small. That's probably too large. But you're dealing with a lot of surface area there, so there is a potential for contamination. Now, I mentioned there's going to be a pit lake. That's good in that when water covers those pit slopes, it tends to slow any production of contamination down. But there will be an area above the water line that's available to provide contamination. And then ideally, this is again a diagram from the EIS. Ideally, because they're pumping water out of this pit and because there is evaporation, that the net flow will be into the pit, so it won't carry any contamination down towards the stream, but you never really know. Really going to have to wait until closure of the mine to see what the pit hydrology is and how it behaves. And having water move from the pit towards a surface water source is always problematic. So what you end up having to do is put wells in this area between the pit and the surface water to try to catch any problems before it can make it into a surface water. On the air impact side, there are a number of sources for air impacts at a mine like Donlin. At a gold mine, most of your potential mercury contamination comes from what's called the electrowinning circuit, which is where you take the gold that's been dissolved in the cyanide and precipitate that out. And when you do that, you also precipitate out mercury, because mercury and gold are very similar, behave very similarly. And that electrowinning does generate enough heat to volatilize the mercury. So that tends to be one major source. The other major source is the oven that actually produces the gold bar that they take away from the mine. And again, that's done at very high temperatures. So anytime you have high temperatures and mercury, you have to worry about mercury being volatilized. And at this mine, we have a third potential source. That's what's called the autoclave, which is the somewhat unique process that's being used to process the ore at this mine. And the reason they do that is because the cyanide doesn't work if it comes in contact with a lot of sulfitic material. So these autoclaves are used to oxidize the sulfides, convert it from a sulfide into an oxide, and then the cyanide will work to take the gold out of the ore. But that oxidation process requires very high temperatures, usually 300 to 500 or even higher degrees centigrade. And again, that's a process that will definitely volatilize mercury. So when you have these autoclaves, you depend on a scrubber system to remove the mercury from the gas emissions from an autoclave. And those scrubbers are fairly sophisticated. They work pretty well. But the reason you worry about it is because if it's not working for some reason, either mechanical failure or whatever, it doesn't take long to put a lot of mercury out into the atmosphere. So you have to watch them very closely, and they have to work as designed, or you will have problems. Now, this picture we have over here on the right shows the modeled deposition of mercury around the mine site. This is the mine site. The red is the mine, and the white with the lines in it is the mine boundary. And this light blue area furthest around the edge of the map is what I'm going to call background. And then you can see increasing levels of mercury as we get towards the mine. But they have an explanation of what this is. And I put these numbers in blue to try to make it a little more easily understandable. So again, this light blue I call the background. The next area is 2 to 5 times background. Then we go up to 10 times background, 20, 25, and 40, which you can barely see this dark blue place in here, but I assume that dark blue place is probably going to enclose most of the mine. Now, a big unknown about air and mercury modeling is this is all modeling, and we don't know any more than what the model tells us. And what you put in has a big effect on the results that are predicted out. Over here on the left, I'm showing you what mercury emissions were predicted to be from the EIS back in 2018. That's 197 pounds a year, even with all that mercury catchment, which is well over 99% of what's projected to be emitted, that they're going to be able to catch. But that 0.5% or less still results in 197 pounds a year of mercury emissions. But interestingly enough, that actually produces some predictions of water quality exceedances for mercury. So when that problem was pointed out to DEC, Donlin Gold just a couple of months ago went back and redid all their mercury calculations, and they now predict that mercury emissions are only going to be 66 pounds a year. So I just use these two numbers to show you what sort of variation you can see in the air quality modeling, and for me it ends up being more of a monitoring issue. That is, we need to really measure and see what's going on, because quite frankly the modeling probably isn't that good. I want to talk about one more issue at Donlin. It's probably my main concern about the mine, and that has to do with the design of the tailings dam and the tailings impoundment. The good news is they're using a downstream type construction, which is the safest type. And down here, I show you the three sort of basic tailings dam design. You can have downstream, which is your typical, when you think of a dam, that's what you think of it looking like. But for tailings dams, there's also a centerline approach, which is basically half of a downstream, or you can do an upstream approach, which is using the tailings to actually provide support as you build this dam higher and higher. Why would you want to do an upstream type approach? Well, the cost of a tailings dam is directly proportional to the amount of material you have to use to construct it. And as you can see, the downstream has the most material in it. Centerline is next, and upstream is the least expensive. But the problem is, when you build on these tailings, you're never really quite sure what the geotechnical properties of those things are. So this type of dam is most prone to failure. That's a problem we don't have at Donlin. They're going to do the downstream. That's good. They're also going to have a full bottom liner. And that's what I'm showing here with this blue line. So that's good. So contamination in the tailings, all liners leak, but hopefully not very much. So that's the idea behind having a liner for the tailings, is that you minimize the amount of contamination that can escape from the tailings themselves. And there's a seepage collection system underneath the liner. So anything that gets through the liner, they can collect and port to water treatment. So that's a pretty safe approach. But they don't plan on putting a liner on top. And because of that, that will allow precipitation to infiltrate into the tailings in perpetuity. And as a result of that, the tailings remain partially or fully saturated in perpetuity. And that's where the potential issue comes from. If you have unsaturated tailings or dry tailings or filtered tailings, as they're called, then if you had a failure, it would probably look something like this. Now, this is a waste rock dump that failed in Nevada, but that's a failure of a relatively solid material. If you have a failure of a material that's fully saturated, then it looks like this. This is the Mount Holly Dam failure in British Columbia, and all that stuff just runs right out and continues to go until something stopped it. And in this case, it was Quesnel Lake, about eight kilometers down. So from a safety standpoint, you'd really like to see this condition and not this one. But this is the condition that we're going to see with the tailings in perpetuity at Donlin. And what would I wish they had done? Well, here's a picture of the tailings dam and the outline of the impoundment. And these red lines are the underdrain system. That's underneath the liner to collect seepage that gets through the liner. What I would have liked to have seen them done is put a similar drain system on top of the liner so that when mining ceases, you can actually let those tailings drain. They're not as good as dry tailings, but they still are a lot closer to this situation than this one. So I know that was pretty quick, but I'd certainly be willing to take any questions if you like. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. That was excellent. And I think there's been a handful of questions that have popped in to the Q&A. Feel free to have a look at the list yourself. I've noticed that there was a question from an anonymous audience member as well as Nancy Waterman, both asking about the word perpetuity and how do we responsibly require post-closure management of any kind in perpetuity, and what does that look like at Pitt Lake?
Well, that's a good question. And up until about 10 years ago, I would have argued that you should never have a mine that's permitted to go forward if it's going to require water treatment in perpetuity. And at that time, the reasoning was because the public is really the ultimate guarantor if the costs of that long-term perpetual water treatment are underestimated. And what we've seen, unfortunately, happen in a number of places is mines closing prematurely, or the financial sureties that were established weren't sufficient to provide that treatment. So it is a financial risk to the public. But because of the Mount Holly failure and some of the recommendations that came from an expert panel that reviewed that, I've changed my mind. And I think that it poses more risk to the public to have those tailings remain wet and mobile. That's a public safety issue. I think it's better to keep them dry, which means that you might have to treat whatever infiltration gets in there in perpetuity. But I think that cost is a much more manageable risk than the potential cost of a dam failure with loss of life. So, and then I go further to say that if you know you're going to have water treatment in perpetuity, it's actually in the company's benefit also to try to minimize those treatment costs. So it's to their advantage to try to treat as little water as possible. And if you know that's going to be an issue from day one, you can design for that. So, long answer to a short question.
That's great, thanks. There's another question here that was, I think specifically you were showing numbers around mercury they did modeling and were estimating how much mercury would be released. Diana McLeod asks, how many pounds per year is problematic? And are those numbers known, or is it very situation dependent?
That's a tough one too, because again, it's not so much how much mercury is emitted, it's how much is methylated. It's methyl mercury that becomes a problem. So that involves literally a chemical conversion from elemental mercury into this methylated form. And you can make some guesses at that, but how right is it going to be? I don't know. So, I mean, the simple answer is I just can't answer the question. But it has been an issue at places in the past. In the upper Midwest, for instance, mercury contamination is an issue in virtually every upper Midwestern state due to this mercury precipitation from the air, due to coal plants, many of which are probably in China, quite frankly, as well as the US. But so yes, we know it can be a problem.
There's also seems to be a theme in several of these questions about emissions and monitoring. So are there well-established parameters for monitoring water quality, such as like conductivity or dissolved oxygen, pH, turbidity, or even for air emissions? Are these well-established parameters, or again,
so
sort of situations?
So the limits are well established. The issue we run into, and the issue we're running into now at this mine with some legal challenges is, are the predictions that they're making accurate? So the problem that we have had with mining for 50 years, literally 50 years, as long as environmental impact states have been done, is that the predictions don't match what actually happens in reality. The predictions always predict no problems, because like I said in the introduction, you can't permit a mine that's predicted to exceed water quality or air quality standards, but it happens all the time. And why is that? And unfortunately, no agency has ever really done a study to figure out why those predictions are going wrong. And I think that's almost a crime.
Yeah, thanks. Your point about modeling and how the results you get, the inputs can dramatically alter the results you get at the end is well taken. Maybe just one more question, and we can move on to Mary's presentation as well. And are there ways to unmethylate mercury, or are there ways to deal with contaminants once they're out in the environment? Is that part of the monitoring, not the monitoring process, but the maintenance process in perpetuity?
Okay, I'm sort of on the edge of my understanding. So you're asking biological question of a geo person, but as I understand it, organisms can flush mercury out eventually, but you don't want to overload a system or cause some damage. So basically, the way to remove mercury out of the system is to stop the source of mercury. But eventually it will work its way through and go away. But the problem being is it doesn't take much.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, there were comments and questions earlier on too about impacts to salmon in these sorts of streams, and I'm sure their livelihood and well-being be dramatically impacted by.
Well, salmon are actually especially in the early stages, not that susceptible to mercury, because they don't spend that much time in the stream. They're there for a while and then they leave. So where you see salmon pick up mercury is out in the ocean, and then they can bring it back. But that's where they would tend to get contaminated. So the organisms that are gonna be most susceptible to the mercury are the ones that are local, that stay there and that are constantly exposed.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I think we'll have more time at the end for additional questions here, but just to make sure we've let's carry on. And our second speaker will be Mary Matthias, who was born and raised in Bethel, Alaska, and works today as the Environmental Program Director of ONC, and formerly ONC's Natural Resource Director. So Mary, please, yeah, thanks so much for joining us, and yeah, please begin when ready.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you for having me. I feel honored to, be invited to participate, and also be one of the panelists here. So, so basically, I was invited to, share my concerns, as a subsistence user, and just speak about why I'm concerned about this mine. And so basically, I never imagined that I would be in the position that I've come to be in to this day, and finding out, that we're in a fight against Donlin, we're in a fight against Jalista and the state. And so me working as an environmental program director in the Indian General Assistance Program, which is the IGAP program, I've served for 11 years now, and I've been I've built a lot of skills in sharing environmental education on human health risks associated with hazardous waste and exposure to harmful contaminants, and finding prevention and gathering community support in targeting preventative measures together, and focusing on rising environmental concerns that our tribal members and those of the public share with us. So, and then after finding out about the environmental impacts that Donlin proposed, and not giving much time for, educating the entire region about this project, and also finding out that, our elders weren't taught about the environmental impacts, like say, the salmon spawning tributaries are in that right next door to that project mine. And a lot of the tribal communities along this Kuskokwim River depend heavily on subsistence gathering. And also I participate and, live a subsistence lifestyle. And this is my home. This has always been my home. And I just can't imagine it being lost to a mine that, that has the potential to destroy this entire region. And, like if it is built and it goes through and then something happens with the tailings mine, we're going to lose so much, our homes, everything. And we will be left with nothing but, the impacts, put into the perpetuity that, like, for example, I was talking yesterday with another person about Prince William Sound and the Exxon Valdez oil spill. So, that's a different impact, because that happened, I think, early 1990s. And so they lost their smelts, and I'm not smelts, the herring and some other fishes, and all the other things that they relied on. They gathered subsistence, and it spent years and years and waiting for their subsistence and natural resources to come back. And then with this mine, there is no coming back once it is, once the lands and waterways are destroyed. It will last forever. And I don't want to be, placed in a position where this will no longer be my home. And looking at our elders, being devastated and not knowing anywhere else to turn, because this is their home too. It's always been their home. It's always been our home. We gather salmon, all types of, all the salmon species that flow through this river, whitefish, barbot, sheefish. There's different species of whitefish that migrate through and out of this river and out into the coastal headwaters out there, and that feed so many families. And I feel very honored and privileged to be working alongside my tribe, the Orutsararmuit Native Council, and our tribal members, and sharing as much education that we can here with them. And then also seeing that our education, our environmental education is reaching out to other neighboring tribal communities, because back in 2018 nobody really knew about Donlin until ONC held its first protest march. And that's when we started rallying other tribal communities. And we're still in this fight. And I encourage that they continue to stand with us, and because we just can't do it alone. And me being in this position, I can't do it alone. Yeah, I don't know what else to say, but I think that would be it for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. I appreciate that insight. And I think you've raised some questions there from the audience as well about risks to traditional foods. And I'd be curious if either Dave or Mary want to speak to, are there other risks other than people have asked about, to berries, to plants, as well as the aquatic life, the fish, and
And speaking about berries, I've always been drawn to the environment. Picking berries has been one of my main things in growing up since I was little. And the tundra, hearing and echoing from elders' point of view that the tundra is like a sponge, and it will soak up anything. And the tailings, it will destroy so much. It'll destroy so much, not just the river. It'll destroy the land. It'll destroy so much.
Thanks, Mary. Yeah, there was a question from an audience member on that point as well about, is there any plan, does Donlin have any plan to do any monitoring of plants in the surrounding area? Dave, feel free to chime in here too if you're.
I haven't looked closely at the monitoring plan. I would think there would be some, but it's probably not going to be a major part of the monitoring. And plants do take up metals. In fact, uptake into plant and then ungulates eating that vegetation has been a problem with molybdenum. So it does happen, but does mercury make it all the way to the berries? I can't answer that question.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, there's anonymous audience member here, but they're mentioning that it's not just the fish, but the migratory birds as well. There's a question here from Ashley MP. It says, to Mary, what does your community do to train up and teach the emerging leaders of the tribe? What are supports that your community may need from allies in either supporting those emerging leaders, resources, materials, etc.?
Could you repeat that question one more time, please?
Of course, yeah. They're asking, what does your community do to train up and teach emerging leaders of the tribe? Presumably to try to address these sorts of issues. So what are the, and then also, what are the supports? Go ahead.
Well, we participate in, Donlin working group, and with this group, we have, invited other tribal communities, to participate in these like monthly meetings to share objectives and our, our goals and our mission. And we also network with Earth Justice, who is serving as, the ONC's lawyer on, and fighting Donlin. And then there's Salmon State, there's Cook Inlet Keeper, there's the Native People's Action, and there's so many more that that we network with and collaborate with, and we try our best to reach out to the other tribal communities, and just keep the union going, so that we're not just fighting alone. Did I answer that question correctly?
Yeah, thanks, Mary. That helps a lot. Yeah, Ashley, Ashley chimes in. That's great to hear. These supports exist. There's a question jumping back kind of to the details of the mine plan from Bev Hoffman, asking about the liner that's going to be used, wondering if it's been used elsewhere, and whether it's failed elsewhere. I think that might be a question for you, Dave.
Well, they talked a bit about the thickness of the liner, but they don't really specify a brand name or who will install it. But that said, what they're proposing is fairly common. I think I previously mentioned all liners leak. It's just a matter of how much they leak, because you don't put them down as one unit. You sort of roll them out like pieces of tape and try to weld them together. So the welds are a weak point, and then they can be punctured by rocks, which is what's going to be on them and under them. And then sometimes the ground moves. Geologic, just construction instabilities typically, or freezing and thawing. So all of those things have led to liners leaking. So again, you just want to make it so that it leaks as little as possible. That's the goal. It's not to make a perfect, nothing will get out, because that doesn't happen.
Thanks, Dave. There's a question here from Katie Rooks asking, how many individual tribal communities are at risk if these potential environmental impacts were to occur, if mining was to go forward? Do either of you know offhand?
Well, we've teamed up with 35 tribes so far, and we're still waiting for more to join. I don't have an exact count of how many tribal communities live along this Kuskokwim River and throughout the YK Delta region.
That's helpful, though. There's another question as well here, asking who the biggest opponents are Who are your biggest opponents, and what can we do to help take action?
So our biggest opponents have been the state of Alaska, DNR, Jalista, BLM. I would say those four. They have been the biggest because, you know, with the state of Alaska, when we have begged and begged for government to government consultation, they would not provide it. Instead they told us that they would rather recognize tribal sovereignty as public individuals from, you know, like any, you know, like me and yourself, like individually. And DNR, you know, that they're allowing the permitting process to go through, even though they do not have, you know, the right Clean Water Act policies in place, like they should have adopted a long time ago when they first began. I can't remember or quote the year when it should have come into effect, but they have not done that, and they're, you know, they're choosing to side with Donlin. And then there's BLM, because, you know, they have decided, you know, with the past Trump administration, that they passed an act, I forget which one, but to open up all federal lands to the mining industry here in Alaska, in our region, so that anyone could, you know, go out and purchase a permit and go in and go poke around in anyone's backyard and get, you know, without permission. And then what's the other one that I said? I can't remember the other one. I'm sorry, it just slipped my mind kind of. I'm sorry.
No worries, Mary. Yeah, my apologies. Yeah, I'm noticing in the chat that, yeah, Melanie Brown chimed in that there's 53 tribes in the Association of Village Council Presidents, and Lindsay Bloom's popped in a link to the No Donlin Gold website with a list of tribes in opposition there as well, for folks who are interested in that. And yeah, I'll put, if you're seeing a lot of links, you are probably maybe seeing a lot of links pop into the chat box. These are things that I'll update our related resources on our Alaska webpage and send out in the follow-up email as well. So don't feel like you need to be copying and pasting every resource that comes out.
I did remember. It's the other one is Jalista. So, you know, they're being the landowners, and they're choosing to ignore shareholders and everybody that lives in this region, just so that they can continue with this mine, just so that they can fill their pockets with money.
Well, we're starting to approach the hour. There's still a few more questions coming in, but I did want to give both you, Mary, and Dave a chance. If you had any final remarks to make to the audience, yeah, feel free to chime in. I'll take a look and see if there's any other questions that we can get to.
I guess I just want to stress that, you know, I'm not saying that all these problems are going to occur, but on the other hand, you know, the company and the state can't say that they won't occur either. And the reason I do the things that I do it is because there have been lots of these problems in the past, and we just have to be cognizant of that and realize that there are big economic benefits that accompany a gold mine like this, and there are environmental and social risks that come with it too.
Yeah, thanks for that, Dave. Mary, do you have any final words?
Yeah, it's, like, just, thank you for hosting this event, this webinar, and inviting me. I look forward to continuing and serving as, the environmental outreach coordinator, that presents and shares and gathers input from the community and our tribal members, and sharing that with, the network, and, just staying in the front lines. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much to both of you guys. There's one question here popped up that we missed earlier from Olivia Eberts, and it's a question for Dave. He said that salmon are more affected by mercury in the ocean. And could he speak to whether the mercury leach from the mine could eventually cause mercury in levels at sea to rise as well?
So the reason salmon are more affected by mercury in the ocean is that's where they spend most of their lives, and that's where they eat organisms from the ocean, and those organisms some of the organisms they eat are the ones that pick up mercury, and then that transfers into the salmon's body. But so it's prevailing wind flows for North America come from the west. So air generally moves from the west to the east. So given the fact that that's the prominent direction of the wind, and the fact that the mine's a long way from the ocean, it's probably not going to have any significant impact on the ocean. The ocean is going to pick up most of its contamination from sort of general background mercury. And again, most of that these days comes from coal. Although large mines that have mercury in the ore, like Donlin, are basically the equivalent of a coal plant, in terms of their emissions.
Thanks for that clarification. That helps a lot. And thank you from Olivia as well. Bev Hoffman chimes in here that a Chillista board members told me, that there's a lot of investment into this project. Yeah, I'm looking at the time, and just want to thank both of you, Mary and Dave, for taking time out of your day to join us and sharing your expertise and your insight and experiences on this issue. I hope we got to a lot of questions. Sorry, my apologies if I missed any along the way, or we can take a look at those and fire some answers in the follow-up email tomorrow. I just have a few little housekeeping comments before we finally say farewell. So I'll send out that email with updated related resources section, as well as an announcement for our next Alaska webinar, which will be next week on Thursday, December 16th at 9 a.m. Alaska time, when we'll be joined by Dr. Linda Birnbaum, who's the former director of the National Institute for Environmental Health. And we'll be talking about the urgent need for state and national and class-based regulations of PFAS, and how these issues pertain to Alaskans and the contaminants to our drinking water in particular. So if you want to ask us any additional questions, feel free to call our office here at Alaska Community Action on Toxics. Our number is 907-222-7714, or you can email us at info@akaction.org. And yeah, please donate to support these Alaska webinars and other efforts. And I really want to thank our guests today and the organizations they represent, and everybody else who really helped to put this event together. So thanks again to everyone for joining us. Thanks again, speakers, and hope everyone has a lovely rest of your day. Yeah, thanks a bunch, Dave. Thanks a bunch, Mary. I think that was really lovely. Bye for now.